Well, hello and welcome to 618. And it has now become considerably warmer. I'm actually burning away here, more or less, which is quite astonishing. This is unusual weather, of course, but why not? Let's enjoy it. And I think it's a good example to show what happens when we don't have space. I have now relocated. I have a nice area to put my stuff, but it still slanted the area. And if we have objects, we have Newtonian space. We have no, or we have less impossibility to perceive that something is not straight. And although this might sound wondrous and weird, it's the truth. We know that people won't notice slanted. Either are they inclining or declining. We simply don't notice those things. It's been an incredible amount of research in how much do we perceive a reality, and it is very, very little. We can't make the difference with some things disappearing, being rearranged, orders being constructed on, colors being lightly changed, even odors, which is the last thing we sort of give up from the body because our sense of smell has a special entry point which sort of do not take the normal entry for the capsus callosum. It goes for the amygdala and all the pieces of the brain. So it's very hard to block out in the same way. But even smell can be blocked out. And these go to show this new state of human beings is of course very stressing. You don't know where you are. And comparing that to, so to speak, primitive inhabitants of this earth, they are incredibly much more skilled at knowing their place, how they are in contrast to other people, and how they are situated. And I found a rather nice article here. See if I can find it. Let's give me a sec here. Let that start. It was an article written a while ago. See, I'm gonna get the name here. It was about how the Indians in North America perceived space and time, and the benefits of perceiving it in the more real way or embodied way, and the actual difference that made. And one obvious thing, and very important, is that they did not separate an object from where it's situated. And this is usually termed the first step to confusion. When you start to having space and just give me a second here, sorry. I'm loading up here. Well, this is about the relationship of the self, the inscape, to the land, the sacred space. Well, the article is from Kagete 2000. Or diversity is action on knowledge gained from many sources applied in a variety of forms. Everything has its source in the natural world. Therefore, learning about and preserving natural resources, the sources of one's life in all senses of the term, are important parts of indigenous science. And one example is that we know very little of the natural world these days. We know very little about what is around us. Our knowledge has quite sternly demolished. If somebody asks me about a bird or a strange plant on the tree, I would usually don't ask me. I'm not a herpetologist. But if you ask a Kayapi Indian in the Zingo River in the Brazil about an insect, a plant, or a bird, they will always know it by name and could relate an anecdote about it. Or modern days scientific expertise is so narrowly, it's so filled with boundaries. So we no longer see science knowledge as a seamless whole. Everything seems to be chopped up like a pork chop. I think pork chop is not a very bad example. Pork chop is a section of the spine that has been chopped up, and we can also think it's been given a specific name. That is the name herpetology. That's the knowledge about that specific aspect of the world. This sort of knowledge will give separation between you and the knowledge of the world. It will make a feeling of distance. And this could also be paired with the whole system that we have today, that it's a subject, it's situated in the head, and this subject takes knowledge, it owns it or it disowns it, and thereby turning knowledge into object, categorizing them, separating them. And just this sheer separatedness makes the picture of a world with separation, because knowledge is in itself separated. It doesn't have interconnectedness. These Kayopi Indians know if the insect is edible, what is their relations to it, does it have any mythological aspects, what does it mean for them, and so forth. Everything is interconnected. And of course, then you are grounded in knowledge. And that might sound weird. How can you be grounded in knowledge? Well, if we leave classical physics, knowledge cannot be something that is not embodied, not of this world any longer. It cannot live in quantum physics in the head somewhere or in the brain, in the vat. Although most academia, most schools today take that for granted, that is living somewhere else. just like Socrates or Plato. It cannot be the case anymore. It simply doesn't work. It's a defunct viewpoint. And the thing I mentioned before about cars situated in a space, and we get the feeling it's a separation between what is a space, a sort of a locator, and the objects in the space, the things in the space. I would say this separation goes as well for knowledge. Knowledge is situated in a bigger frame, and in this frame you put them in. This is about herpetology, this is psychology, this is physiology, and when we have problem with our bodies we go to a physician. Somewhere already started there, something already started, a separatedness, and it might be the ailment, my pain in my back, my strain in my knees that I'm actually feeling right now, and my separatedness towards what's around me, something other I have a feeling for here and now. It's caused by also how we look at knowledge. It would be very hard to find any native primitive beings that doesn't know about the nature, doesn't know about reality, we have to say, because this is reality. This is what we are embodied in. Our bodies is not somewhere else in Alpha Centauri, or why not Betelgeuse. It's situated here on Earth, whether we like it or not. And of course there's a whole bunch of people who doesn't like it, but that's up to them. I think I mentioned that Schrödinger said the most important part when understanding quantum physics is it's a training both of mind and body. You can't count on making any progress if it's not embodied. Just doing it in the mind is the wrong approach from the beginning. It subsumes the division it tries to solve. And that division is completely fake, which is part of the problem. The division between mind and body is in a way completely arbitrary. It's not grounded in anything real. And that makes me now standing here on a slope that is slanting and I don't even notice it most of the time. It's the separation between the transparent or transcendent subjective and the world. Everything in this life world of the Kayopi Indians is interconnected. It is the elders who are the expert, who transmit the knowledge through storytelling, example, language. Interrelationship in this world is in constant motion. It is the spirit of the invisible particle waves that gives everything life. It's the hollow movement. Spirit is the connector that binds everything together so that everything is interrelated and interconnected. And here's a cite from Kajete. Recognition that human beings hold an important place in such a creation is tempered by the thought that they are dependent on everything in creation for their existence. The awareness of the meaning of life comes from observing how the various living things appear to mesh to provide a whole tapestry. This last was a quote from DeLorean 92. Graveline, another author, leads the reader to the point that Vakunta is the sum total of all things, an Indian expression, the collective totality that always was, without beginning, without end. Neither a force nor a spirit. It is the inexplicable sharing togetherness that makes all things, animate and inanimate, of equal value, equal importance, and equal consequence because they are all vakonta simultaneously. Their forms collectively creating the four of vakonta, which is obviously incapable of being anthropomorphized. It's something we can understand, but it's also something that is bigger, almost like indigenous North American expressions for implicit. Western scientific theory generally operates within boundaries that embrace fragmentation through objectivity and isolation, whereas native science operates with the understanding that everything is in relationship with everything else. And here's an interesting author, Lyell Watson, Lyall Watson, author of Supernature States. And here's a quote. It's not a state, it's a quote. The name of the book is Supernature States. No, the name of the book is Supernature, and it states, sorry about that. There is a continuous communication not only between living things and their environment, but among all living things in that environment. An intricate web of interaction connects all life into one vast, self-maintaining system. Every part is related to every other part, and we are all parts of the whole. And every aspect of traditional life is reflected in the concept of interconnectedness, because, as Lyell says, the complexity of daily interconnectedness of all life. This understanding and describing the balancing of various forms of energy is the foundation of what we call traditional science. Or native community, and this is from Kajete, is about living a symbiotic life in the context of a symbolic culture, which includes the natural world as a vital participant and co-creator of community. That is to say, the life of the indigenous community is independent with the living communities in the surrounding natural environment. Communities mirrored the stages of created evolution and the characteristics of the animals, plants, natural phenomena, ecology, geography, found in their place through a rich oral tradition. Through the oral tradition, story becomes both a source contentment as well as a methodology. Story enables individual and community life and the life and process of the natural world to become primary vehicles for the transmission of native culture. The culture's vitality is literally dependent on individuals in community with the natural world. And the last one here is a tough one, I would say. Indigenous cultures are really extensions of the story of the natural community of a place and evolve according to ecological dynamics and natural relationships. And we have a little story here from Kajeti. The first time I met my Mirimachi Indian Aunt Helen, she gave me the gift of sweetgrass to take home. She said, "You burn it and it smells nice," she said. But there was a lot more to the story. Over the time I've come to associate it with prayer and speaking as one with the Creator. If I have a dream of a plant or an object and big sword or smudge smoke is rising from it, I know it is going to be medicine for me, that it prays for me. The sacred tobacco called Detamaway is a mixture of red willow, vidje, naturlig indiantobacco och and other herbs like sweetgrass. Or this plays many roles. It is medicine, it is from the earth, but once you have prepared it, it is an embodiment of your own energy. And I think this points, so to speak, to the implicit here. Because in Occidental thinking, we have this separation between knowledge being somewhere else, space being somewhere else, and also time being somewhere else. And there is an effect in between these separated entities, which help to produce constructions. And when it comes to knowledge, it takes maybe some of its material, a little bit like time takes its material from room. We earlier read about Lakoff Johnson to show that time usually takes the metaphor of room to be perceived. And that of course affected time. It gives it openness, but it can also create limitations. And a very, very strict Western view that is affected by the subject-object arbitrary division that we suffer from, maybe it's a hard word, but that we have, made time early on, already with Xenon, to be something unnatural, something not of this world. Already we gone up to the heads. It's a time that you can manipulate in ways that doesn't make any sense. Divide time so as a hare cannot reach, the tortoise is chasing. And isn't it interesting? The Greek people were living in the world. We have it around us here. But somewhere the trauma happened, and even if they were so grounded, and of course continue to be grounded, nothing really happened that was extreme until 2000 years later. But something did happen. It was a rupture. It was a break. It was something menacing, I would say. Something dark turned up in human beings. And they seek to heal this rupture. They seek to heal the break. But they did it in the wrong way. They went further and further away. What was the conclusion of Zenon's paradox? Yeah, it was sadly enough that there is something more real than reality. That time is actually situated somewhere else, and we cannot perceive it. And we are very, very distant from that time. It's a horrible, one could say that knowledge, because this is all made by knowledge, but knowledge took a path that was a deviation. It's a little bit like you're walking in the woods, you're following a path, and all of a sudden you forget what you're doing. You get into a state of mind wandering, and all of a sudden you start walking on a path you hadn't chosen. You would never choose. And we are still on that path. The unchosen path. Path nobody controlled. And that's part and parcel of the magnitude of the problem. If it would have been a conscious, deliberate thought, none of these problems would have turned up in Western civilization, in Western thought development. But it wasn't. It's the sheer arbitrariness of the division that is the problem. And this is what makes it something that just turns up. And what is a thing for us that just turns up? It's reality. Can you see how it lures us? Because we know it's not man-made, or we think it's not man-made. It's hard to tell the difference here. I'm not sure myself. But it doesn't matter. It just turns up in our reality. And we take it to be real because nobody wanted this. It doesn't have the taint of knowledge. It was not an informed decision. And just because of that, we take it to be objective, natural. Isn't that weird? But this is how it must have happened. And this is also, I would say, the implicit conclusion from Feyerabend. What does make us to stay stuck in this perception is that it from the beginning was arbitrary, non-intended. I could make a comparison here. Assume that you grow up in a communist country, for instance Albania or somewhere else. If you live there, you will be exposed to what we could call, liberally here, we're talking broad terms, intentional worldview from a communistic, Maoistic viewpoint. But that's intentional. If you leave the country, you can discover that. You can see this was intentionally made. It has the taint, the smell of something intentionally made, because it makes up a whole system. And you can see this was thought out by a human being or an ideology. And most of these things you can sort of rid yourself of because of this tendency. But this cannot be made with the same effectivity with something arbitrarily. For the first thing, we tend to accept arbitrarily things not man-made, slumpmässiga saker as in Swedish, as part of the natural world. The very sign, the very taste, the very, like in this analogy from Kajete, the smell of the smoke. But this smell of the smoke doesn't heal us. It lures us. It lures us like Xenon, Parmenides, Aristotle, Plato, to go even further away. And I think this is also what Tartan Tolko means with an arbitrary focal setting, not intended setting. And this is this arbitrary focal setting that makes up the objects. If the objects were effective, sure enough, the Indians would have invented objects. They could have use for them in hunting. But the thing is, in Greek culture, in later Roman culture, objects never had that space to take, that role. It did not, or they didn't become part of the movie until much later. Maybe in the beginning with Descartes, maybe it got more gravely with the Enlightenment area, for sure it did, without a doubt. And then the object tend to make the most important decisions. And the objectify knowledge. The knowledge situated in a space which is separated from, and this space we use to say this is a part of that knowledge, that's philosophy. And over there in XYZ 1265, there you have anthropology. And over there we have medicine at XYZ 14.6.28, something like that. We situate knowledge in space and thereby separate it, and thereby making the illusion knowledge is internally separated. And the more you separate it, the more distinct it becomes, the more precise and the better. Something that Wittgenstein turned against because he said the most exact expressions are not very clear. They shouldn't be clear because they cannot work in a world that is not distinct. While in the language game of the Muraslev, whatever that is called in English, obviously the slave is the most precise thing you can say. You cannot reach a higher degree of precision. You will disrupt the language way when you start to make it more precise. And then you will be like Wittgenstein was when he wrote Tractatus. You will be lost in some way. It's not that the extra material makes the process more cumbersome or tougher. It's that you are completely wrong. To specify Muslim is just wrong. It's not an extra. So you see the analogy here. Specification going to the bigger. You have reductionism that says that small knowledge gathers together become big knowledge. You see that the world is made of smaller things. Let's find out the smaller things. This is part of the problem, seeing it that way. It could actually be confusing to say there are no small things, because it's the whole process, rather, the obscuring movement that is the problematic thing. And I think I send a link to one of you. The other one can send it to someone, the other one. And that link was about neural geometry. And it goes to show that there is a sort of geometry going on inside the neurons as well, a sort of space made up. And it's inflammable. You cannot fathom thinking without space. And if I think there is no space in my thought, you have crowdedness. I can directly admit I don't feel that my thoughts are spacious, and therefore they're lacking in space. They are crowded. Because we fill up our mental space with the objects, whether they now are knowledge objects or room objects, space objects, time objects. This is constantly filling up. And this is a constructing that leads to friction. Whereas we always had space, there is room for activity. And there is room both inside the objects and around all objects. We always have loads of space around us. And you can think about the Klein bottle here, because it's both an isolated object, a defined object, but its surface is at the very same time expansive, non-terminable. And it has an inside, it has an outside, but at the same time inside and outside is the same thing. Enticing, isn't it? It's starting to get intriguing here. So space comes from space and it goes into space again, just like the Klein bottle. And why don't you look around yourselves now and contemplate this? Let perception be drawn out by the association which are given to the ordinary term space. What associations do you get? Do you get positive associations? Do you think space is something separated? An extra XYZ in the coordinate system of Descartes? Or is it something more vivid, lively? On one hand, maybe it's distance in meters, centimeters, kilometers. Distance is the ready-made objects in the constructed self, sphere, owned or disowned. And you will see there is actually no difficulty in finding space. But what is space in itself? Well, there's a thought that came up with the Klein bottle in quantum physics, well, Julian Barber. And though we do not ordinarily ask this question, the answer which would commonly come to mind is perhaps that space is what makes room for objects and activities. But at the same time, this simple definition seems somewhat inaccurate. However, for physical space does not do anything. Also, perceived space and its contents are interrelated, co-defining, so that the visible space of the situation is not more basic than the objects. So perhaps there is no space in itself, or none that has much positive significance. Well, that's an ordinary conclusion, mostly made by analytical philosophers. But there are reasons to question this conclusion. For while a narrow focal setting or a narrow focal setting, alltså en fokusinställning som är ganska smal, may make it possible to show up objects. A change in setting will reveal space. If I'm here, I see my objects around me, and I go up in space, all these things will turn out to be space again. Once there were objects in a physical inert space, and they become space again, whereas I move upwards. Now you also see the reason why it's so important to take in the sky and what's surrounding you, because that will ease up the tension that the objects make, the friction, the hardiness, the sheer density of them. That makes the body stiff, dull, insensitive, non-perceptive, non-thinking, non-living actually even. Brain in a vat, you name it. And another perspective is the objects in the initial situation down here on Earth will need space to exist. And the seeing of the objects and the space also occurs in a kind of space. And this is very interesting. Remember how seeing started, the idea of vision, perceiving things. Something that didn't exist, ex anterior, and then ex posterior existed, and then that's something that we assume today always existed, there always were the objects, which is completely false. But that also occurs in space. I mentioned we now know that thinking is space. It's handling of space, transformance of space, opening up of spaces. But also seeing is a kind of space. And as such, seeing can return to space in the same way that levitating here will make these objects around me turn into sheer space. It's a matter of scale in one perspective, but there is no scale in that sense. You see, scale comes in here. Scales is one of the things, the cog-hjul, the cogs that keeps our chained in a way. It's a tough word, but it's part and parcel of the process. The scale idea comes together with object, comes together with coordinated space, comes together with space as nothing, comes together with space being right here now, because that's also important, because the next moment I can be somewhere else and this can be turned into space again and the objects disappear. So we need all these cog-hjul, cogs, to sort of lock the situation. And this locked situation is also the focal setting, the arbitrary chosen focal setting that gives object. So it's a little bit like the Indian story I told you before here, from Kajoli and this borderline, was that his name? No. They tell us in the natural native Indians, the living word, knowledge, space, time is all part of an interconnectedness. They don't see fragmentations. They haven't put knowledge into different separated handbags. I mentioned before that it could be a good way to perceive objects as handbags in a way. So everything comes together, it makes a whole. And this wholeness makes it real. But in some way, our reality have to be made real for us. And that's the interconnectedness between the cogwheels, the coordinate system, the subject-object partitioning. All that comes together to make our lower space, our Newtonian world, real for us? And this goes for both a more open space and a lower space down here. And that's quite interesting, because now we have a definite property what makes things to feel or appear real. And we can see that in a change of focal setting, going higher up, we can reach higher space. And we can also choose to go down. And in this downward, we have the similar functioning that makes it appear to be real. But on the higher level, we will find a similar functioning, and that functioning will be saying this is reality, and it will be even stronger because we don't have to deal with all these partitionings. But it's a good leadway to understand what is something being perceived as real. It's coming from many things at the same time, at least 6, well, not a dozen, well, maybe a dozen, and they all come to part at the same time, and they cannot be dissolved by one. We can be working with them but one by one, but at a certain instance the cogwheels will catch into the different cogs, and the machinery will be working in a higher level, and that would make it real, and you can step out into the higher reality. This is actually quite good. Now we have a property for what makes things feel real or be perceived as real. And we cannot think about classical physics to be that simple. It is actually a very complicated system, even if it was started by the Greeks on arbitrary ground. It's very complicated. And it needs work to be softened up, because it has a realness to it. And that property is there. There's no doubt about it. It has a realness. Otherwise, we wouldn't be stuck into it. And this is something that Wittgenstein and also Ian McGilchrist readily admits. It's either you call it the sphere of the Western Hemisphere or the left hemisphere. It's pretty convincing. It's not to be broken easily. And it cannot be broken only in one aspect. You have to take all the aspect, and something, when you get a certain softness of the whole subject, they can sort of dissolve, and you can go a bit higher up, then you can levitate and see that space disappears. I think it was some sort of progress here. I'm very happy for that. Well, it's way too warm here, and I say cheers. Thank you.